Okay, welcome back to The Take with Charles Butler. And, boy, we've had a rip-roaring show today. We've had Mr. Andrew Mangione from the Association of Mature American Citizens talking about Obamacare policies, and Mr. Tom Sedeka talking about small businesses and the attack by the Obama administration, Planned Parenthood, the Labor Department, IRS, on small businesses that don't conform to their socialist, Marxist agenda. Unconscionable. But look, we're going to bring on another young man today. He's not so young, and very seasoned. Mr. Travis Korson, who is with the Frontiers for Freedom Institute. And we're going to talk a little bit about freedom today, the freedom to fish and the free market. Welcome, Travis. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you, Charles?
Outstanding. Hey, look, tell us a little bit about the Frontiers for Freedom Institute and this Fishing Freedom Act that you're involved with in Washington.
Sure. So the Frontiers of Freedom Institute was founded by Senator Malcolm Wallop after he retired from his long and very successful career in the Senate. And we were founded as a 501c3 nonprofit with the mission of basically carrying on the policy principles that he stood for while he was in the Senate. He was a big proponent of national defense, but was also very concerned with natural resources issues, being a senator from a western state where natural resources and the like made up a big part of his economy. So with that in mind, one of the issues that Frontiers of Freedom has been working on is a free market fisheries issue, something called catch shares. We've started an initiative called the Catch Shares Coalition to promote this project, and that can be found on the web at fishingandfreedom.com. And basically, I'll just kind of walk through what catch shares are a little bit now. So up until 1976, there was absolutely no regulation whatsoever in the ocean. By the mid-70s, there was a very serious overfishing problem that was occurring. The government saw a need to step in and put some sort of measures in place to make sure that these fisheries would be preserved for future fishermen, for future consumers, for future folks. So at the time, they started by just limiting fishing days. And over the course of about 30 years, it morphed into this large, crazy program that went from limiting the amount of days to limiting the size of your boat to limiting the size of your engine to limiting, to saying what kind of equipment you could use, where basically the bureaucrat pretty much might be on the boat right next to the captain, because that's how heavy the hand of government was weighing down on these fishing captains. So with that in mind, in 2006, the Bush administration started implementing catch shares as an alternative to this old command and control Soviet-style type system that was in place for regulating our fisheries. So what catch shares do is they basically introduce property rights into these fisheries by giving these fishermen who have historically been in these fisheries a percentage or a share in these fisheries. These are property that they own, and the thought is that they will now have a personal stake in encouraging the health of the fishery. Because they own these shares, they want to see the fisheries get healthier, the percentage of their take become larger, and basically use that as a method to regulate the fisheries much more lately than they have been, and also encourage them to use the market principles to encourage them to be both environmentally sustainable and economically feasible for the fishermen.
Right. Okay. And so where are you now in terms of legislation? Where are you? What's the big push now? Because I remember when I got to San Diego. San Diego had the largest tuna fleet in the world. Today, you can't find a tuna ship anywhere in San Diego Harbor.
Sure. So the Magnuson-Stevens, like I said, in 2006 was when catch shares were implemented under the last reauthorization for Magnuson-Stevens. It is up again this year for reauthorization. So currently, 65% of America's fisheries are governed by this catch shares program. and there are about 35% of the fisheries that are not under this program. So what we're hoping to do is kind of twofold. We're hoping to make sure that funding is set aside in the NOAA to make sure that implementation of the catch shares programs for those remaining fisheries can be funded. We've had a couple problems. The first thing is that the NOAA isn't spending the money the way that they should. They have had money set aside for this, but unfortunately, they've been more interested in spending it on climate change satellites that are, saying that the polar ice caps are shrinking when they're actually expanding than they are in putting it into this hard science and into these implementation programs that we need. So we need to make sure that when we're appropriating funds at the end, we're actually spending them the way that they should. If we don't get these 35% of fisheries off of this current command and control system that are still on there, we're going to be looking at about spending $1 billion over 10 years in taxpayer dollars on subsidies. So this is also a small government issue for folks that really care about, spending taxpayer dollars wisely, because there's a lot of money spent every year bailing out these failed fisheries and basically subsidizing these fishermen in these fisheries that have been mismanaged by this old command and control system. The second thing that we're working to do is we're working to make sure that the science is improved in these fisheries so that fishermen can actually can make sure that they set the catch at a take that is appropriate. Congressman Whitman, who's been one of the great leaders on this issue of Virginia, actually introduced a piece of legislation right before recess to provide more resources within the federal government for better science for these fisheries. So we want to not only make sure in the reauthorization that the catch shares implementation is funded and funded properly, but that we can also hopefully get legislation passed by Congressman Whitman to provide better science for the fisheries and to create a better program for the fishermen and for the other stakeholders involved in this program. Now,
go ahead.
Now, there are a few concerns that people have raised as far as catch shares as a program, which I'd like to just run through for your listeners. One of the big things that people are concerned is market corrections, and there will be a slight market correction because generally there are fleets that are too large because they're being subsidized by some of these federal government subsidies that I was mentioning. So you will see a reorganization of fleets, but it generally ends up being a much better system for the fishermen. For example, wages have increased over 100% in Alaska where they've implemented this for the fishermen. In the Gulf of Mexico, where the red snapper program's been going on, the value of the fishery increased 82%, and the ex-vessel price of red snapper increased by 17%. So not only are you getting higher wages, you're also getting higher prices for the fish for these fishermen. Another concern that we hear from some people is that they think it sounds like some sort of a cap-and-trade program for fisheries. Now, one of the big things that we argue with that is absent, the United States government, long before there was the United States government, long before the United States was even discovered, there was a market for fish. Unlike carbon credits, where absent some government bureaucrats saying, you've got to pay to distribute carbon into the atmosphere, there's no demand for that. So all we're saying is we want to take those market principles, that natural demand that exists, and take it and put it into a more market-based system, one where property rights are involved, as opposed to kind of the command and control race to fish that's currently going on. And one of the other concerns that a lot of people have is about recreational fishers. A father and son want to go out onto a boat, with their, for a day, catch a couple fish. That is totally cordoned off. We don't want to make, fathers and sons and private boat owners have to buy a small catch share in order to go out and grab a fish or two. So those folks are totally exempt from the program. This applies only to commercial fishermen who are really the ones who are suffering most under this command and control system that has been implemented by Washington bureaucrats.
So why the regulation? I mean, do they just need to hire more people? It doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, like I said before, we saw the tuna industry decimated in America and moved to the Samoan Islands for no other reason than regulation. and it put thousands of Chicagoans out of work.
I can't speak exactly to what happened at the tuna fishery, but if I had to make a guess, what I suppose probably happened was one of the big ways that they've been clamping down on these fisheries is by shortening the fishing seasons. And what I suppose they did is they shortened the fishing season so much, probably only to in some fisheries you've seen it shortened to a matter of days, that it was just no longer economically feasible for these fishermen to stay. Instead of implementing a new system where they would have the flexibility to fish year-round and they could work with the NOAA and actually negotiate tonnage based off historical catches versus an arbitrary, we're going to give you this many days this year, where it's much more difficult to fight and to negotiate with the NOAA and the regional fishery management councils that govern a lot of this. I suspect that's what happened. And the problem with these short fishing seasons that's also making it difficult is because you've got to pull out as much as you can in a short period of time. It has become such a capital-intensive endeavor because your boat has to meet such a niche-specific series of regulations, and it has to be so large because you're limited sometimes by the amount of trips you can make and these other things. There was just too much upfront money that was required for these fishermen for these boats. So they up and packed and probably went to places where the regulations were a lot lighter and it was a lot easier for them to fish, because that's the problem that we are seeing in a lot of these local fisheries. One of the other people that are hurt a lot by this, and especially tourism areas, are small family-owned restaurants, because what's happening to them is they're not able to get this steady supply of fish year-round. There's a glut that comes in once a year, and then what they have to do most of the year is not buy from these American fishermen and go to these overseas fisheries that you mentioned, where some of these other San Diego fishermen have went to get their fish, because they can't find it here in the United States, when there are plenty of folks who want to go out there, who want to provide a supply year-round, but are just not able to do that by the laws that are currently dictated by the federal government in those fisheries that are not under catch shares.
Well, this catch share thing sounds awfully dangerous to me. And, I come from the West Coast, where you have plenty of restaurants that depend on the local fishing market. And when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about this. And but I have Mr. Travis Korson from the Freedom Institute on with me. We got about a minute here, Mr. Korson, so I'm going to give you the last word. Tell our listeners how to get to Frontiers of Freedom Institute website and read some of your work and whatever else you want to tell them.
Sure. So thank you again for having me, Charles. To learn more about our Catch Shares initiative and the Catch Shares Coalition, I encourage you to visit our website, which is fishingandfreedom.com. And I encourage you to visit our Facebook page, facebook.com/fishingandfreedom. To learn more about Frontiers of Freedom, you can visit our website, which is ff.org. Once again, we just want to encourage you to learn more about this catch shares issue, because the long and short of it is that taxpayers save and fishermen profit. So fishing and freedom.